and welcome to the Pearson English Podcast, the show in which my panel and I chat to the most interesting and influential people in the field of ELT. I'm your host, Richard Cleave, and joining me on the panel this month are Sam Wadsworth.
Hello.
And Zoe Zamancic.
Hi.
Hi, Zoe, and welcome to our panel. This is the first time we've had you on here.
It is. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be a part of the podcast.
We're excited to have you. How's pandemic life treating you?
Yeah, not too bad. I can't complain. I'm very much looking forward to seeing my friends again soon, though, and meeting up with all our coats on outside in a park somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. I can't wait. All right, let's go on with the show. So Google teaching beginners and you'll find articles riddled with words like daunting, challenging, and nerve-wracking. But isn't this doing beginner classes a bit of a disservice? In my experience, low-level groups were often some of the most rewarding. They forced me to be more creative, and the students make such rapid progress, you really feel like you're making a difference. So how can we change people's perceptions? And what is a beginner anyway?
Well, who better to ask than this month's guest, Rhona Snelling. Rhona is an experienced author, teacher, and editor who specialises in low levels. Rhona, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Good to be here.
So, Rhona, what is a beginner? Is that a bit of a misleading term?
Yes and no. I think beginner, as the term, it does the job to a degree. In its simplest, crudest form, it's someone who is beginning or starting something new. So, yeah, it's okay. But it is misleading because, as we all know, students don't come out of a factory exactly the same. There isn't a beginner student factory and boop, 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 out they pop, shiny new students on a production line, boom, 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 they're all identical. That's not the case. We've got group differences within that label of beginner. So two very broad definitions within that. The two common categories are a false beginner and a true beginner. So a false beginner would be typically a student from the developed world. They've had some prior exposure to English. And that might be from when they studied at school years and years ago and they didn't keep up with English. It could be because they're really into English language songs or movies, so they've picked up the odd word here and there. Or they could have experienced English through Starbucks, Amazon, all those commercial words that are out there. Then the other category we've got is the true beginner, and they're also known as the zero beginner or the absolute beginner. And these might be students from a developing country, say people who are displaced and have refugee status. So they've had little to no exposure of English prior to starting this course of study. And within that, there may also be literacy issues. So again, another subcategory within beginners. I think, though, one of the best ways to categorise and to explain a beginner and to look at their competencies, I always refer to the Common European Framework of References for Languages. I think this is really useful in indicating the competencies and where you want to put your student if you want to label them as pre-A1, A1 or A2, so those are the basic level within the chart, and they're not going to be at B1, B2, the middle level, or C1, C2, that expert level. So A1, A2, there at the bottom. I can just read you a few sentences of what the A1 descriptor is. I think this is quite useful to know. It's just a few sentences. So at A1, students can understand and use familiar everyday expressions and very basic phrases aimed at the satisfaction of needs of a concrete type. Can introduce him, herself and others and can ask and answer questions about personal details such as where he, she lives, people he, she knows and things he, she has. They can interact in a simple way, provided the other person talks slowly and clearly and is prepared to help. So from there, we know that a beginner is going to need language that's relevant, immediate, simple. They can apply it straight away to that sort of linguistic survival of what they need their language for.
Rhona, if you have a student who's learned English in the past and got above A1, A2 into the Bs, etc., but then stops and hasn't studied it for ages, and then it's 10, 15, 20, 30 years later and they're adults, would those be false beginners or are they not really false beginners? They are just sort of rusty B2s?
Yeah, I would say the rusty B2s really, but it might be that unfortunately they're going to end up in a beginner class for a little while until that long-term memory kicks in and that language gets activated again. And you just, before you've dealt with that attrition of language, and then I'd expect them to be shooting up the levels and getting back to the rightful place.
So now we know what beginners are, and we've defined that term. Why do you think so many teachers struggle with teaching low-level groups, or do you think they struggle?
Yeah, I think they probably do. It's for me, I always get the impression that it's quite a divisive level to teach, that teachers love it. And like you said at the beginning, Sam, it's rewarding and it's a fantastic level. There's lots of positives there, and others who will avoid the level as much as they possibly can. And I think there's probably two reasons why that is. And it's, in my opinion, a lack of support and a lack of experience. And by that, I mean that a lack of support, that if you look on the average bookshelf in the average classroom, there are fewer lower level materials there, particularly A1 or pre-A1. And lack of experience, there are fewer lower level courses, and therefore teachers don't have the opportunity to go in and observe another class so they can pick up some hints from a more experienced teacher. And they haven't got that, that classroom mileage of actually teaching a lot of lower levels there. If you compare that, for example, if I said to you, for example, you've got an hour and I need you to teach a B1 class, I think most experienced teachers would probably be okay with that, because you've probably got a lesson and a little box of tricks and a lesson that's good to go for you to teach. Or you can look on the bookshelf and there will be loads of materials for you to grab. You won't need to grade your language a great deal in that class. Your students will have a decent degree of language competence. Whereas if I said you've got an A1 class in an hour, I think that's a bit more frightening, because you might not have had much experience at that level. You may never have taught that level. You're probably not going to have a lesson ready to go. As I've said, there probably isn't a book on the shelf pre-A1 for you to jump into, and you will have to grade your language so that you're comprehensible. So for me, I think it's those two things, the lack of support and the lack of experience.
Okay, so what about you? Why do you love teaching beginners?
They're so rewarding. The progress you get is immense when you go from just getting out a word, a single word right at the beginning, and that's an achievement in itself. And then a couple of weeks, a couple of months later, there's a conversation, or there's some shared jokes, or they graduate and go into an elementary class, for example. It's fantastic. It's amazing to be part of that journey. And I think the other brilliant thing is I love the rapport you get. I think that's much, much stronger with the lower levels, because you've got that sense it's quite desperate. So everyone's in it together. And you as a teacher are going to be grading your language, looking a bit stupid, probably doing TPR and gesturing a lot. You're all in this sort of combined effort to get there and start this journey. So I think you have a really great bond with them. And it's wonderful to see that progression and that confidence grow.
Absolutely. Okay, so what are the main areas to focus on when teaching beginners?
So everything is the short answer. But your students first and foremost, it's starting with them. Who are they? Finding out about them. What has made them, particularly as an adult, choose to sign up for this course? Is it because there's a super promotion at work? Is it because they're looking forward to the pandemic ending and getting out travelling? And what's the reason behind that? Are they true beginners? Are they false beginners? Are they rusty B1s? Where are they? So I think that's where you've got to start and do that needs analysis. And for that, I think that's okay to use the L1 if you need to, because it is the needs analysis, and it's that administrative aspect, isn't it, of teaching. So find out about who they are. From there, you can then look at the syllabus and the objectives. Maybe you've got a course book which will fit your needs, and that's fantastic. I'd encourage you within your syllabus to think about keeping up that balance of skills. So you've still got reading, writing, listening, speaking in equal measure. It's just thinking that, okay, so reading might just be 2 or 3 sentences, and that's fine. It's still reading. Keep that balance, and also keep the balance of the 4 language systems. So you've got your grammar, you've got your lexis, you've got your phonology, you've got your functional language. Keep up to date with all of them. And then when you're there and in the class, you want to think that what you're teaching is achievable. It's at that right level. We've spoken about the levels within the term beginner. You've got the right amount of language for the input. So for lexical items, and research always suggests 6 to 9 items as being a good amount to teach and for students to learn. So maybe for topics like food, something that's not abstract, you can increase that number. But as a general rule of thumb, aim to keep your input manageable and comprehensible. Think about repetition. As much as you can, review, recycle, reuse, keep doing that. So for example, that's just simply maximising your material. If there's a little reading text on the page, then get students to read it aloud again, read it in pairs to each other, pick out some words which are difficult within that text and spell, so you're practicing the alphabet. Take a sentence, jumble up the words and put them on the board. Students have to put them in the right order, something like that. Within the classroom, think about the achievability of your tasks and the repetition. And then also you maybe want to think about L1. Are you going to use a bit of the first language or not? And there's absolutely a reason to sometimes. It can help build confidence. It can be a relief as well for the students to have a bit of a breather. But obviously you don't want to be doing that all the time, I'd suggest, because you don't want that over-reliance on it. And students are here to learn English. During that small amount of time when you're in your lesson, give them as much good exposure to it as you can. So think about your L1 and link to that. It's also teacher talk time and student talk time. So if there's a way you can just be saying a little bit less, so what you say is relevant, you're not whittering on about something irrelevant or giving confusing, verbose instructions, think about that. And think about all those opportunities to increase student talk time and get them talking. And within that, don't be afraid of silence, because there might be a bit of a pause whilst they're thinking of an answer or trying to choose that word or processing what you've said. So allow for that and don't worry about it. Think about using TPR if that's appropriate. So that total physical response, the miming, the gestures, anything to make your input memorable and engaging and meaningful is fantastic. And last but not least, it's about monitoring and your feedback when you're in the class. So keep monitoring all the time. How's the lesson going? Are they struggling? Can you do a little bit more in the next lesson? Or do you need to perhaps change that beautifully crafted lesson plan you've had and actually teach the class that's going on now? Do you need to tweak it a bit and change and make it perhaps a little bit easier, or just repeat one activity, explain something again? Just always keep an eye out for what's going on and to think about that rapport and that empathy. How are they all feeling? Is it terrifying? Do they feel okay? Are they relaxed? Think about all those points as well.
So is there a difference between how you approach teaching false beginners from true beginners, or is it a case that one is just, say, a little bit of time ahead of the other?
I think it probably is that simple. It's just one is a little bit ahead, but even mixed ability classes across all levels, aren't they? But I think particularly A1, A2, I don't think the difference is as great. So it's not something that I personally worry about as a teacher, because I think that need to repeat and to reinforce false beginners or true beginners, both need that.
And I suppose linked to that then, is there a difference between adults and young learners? I know that Zoe, you work on young learner material. So is there a sort of fundamental difference in the way that you approach those classes at that level?
I think, for me, I'd say young learners, it's obviously going to be a lot more energy, a lot more activity. And I'm not sure if busier or pacier is quite the right word, but they're going to be always engaged. You don't want to allow any moments of distraction and wandering minds. So you want to have a really well-packed, prepared lesson plan, more activities than you're going to get through, so that you're completely covered. And probably more L1, I'd say, with young learners, simply because of that cognitive, they're not going to be as cognitively advanced as an adult learner, of course. So you've got that issue as well to think about, and maybe that's useful for classroom management at the beginning, or for behaviour issues or safety issues, those sort of important bits of communication.
Can linguistic theory help with low-level classes?
Yes, definitely. That's my short and simple answer. End of the podcast. Yeah. So linguistic theory and applied linguistics is basically the application of knowledge regarding linguistics into the classroom. So we look at how those theories play out with actual teachers and actual students and in the classroom. So it's a very applied science. There's loads that are really relevant. For me, there's a handful that I find particularly pertinent and I've always got in my mind. I always, as I've just said about seeing that theory play out, I think these are ones that you will see in your beginner class, in your lower level class. So I think the first important one is the contrastive analysis hypothesis. And this predicts the success of your language learning according to the closeness of your first language and the second language and those shared similarities. So if there are two languages that are similar, so say a Spanish native speaker and they're learning Italian as their second language, these are languages that are close on the Indo-European Romance language tree. Because they're close, this hypothesis predicts that there's going to be a positive transfer of language. There will be fewer errors. And so your progress will be more rapid than if your first language and your second language are dissimilar. So, for example, a French native speaker who's learning Japanese as a second language. So there you've got the different script, the different alphabet, it's non-Latin, you've got the pitch, you've got the moire, the syllables. So there, this hypothesis would predict a negative transfer and a greater number of errors and a slower progression. And I've certainly seen that play out in class, that you will get that difference in progression for sure. Another good one, thinking about achievability that I mentioned a moment ago, is the cognitive load theory and just being aware of the capabilities of the working memory. So we know that the working memory is limited in what it can hold. So back with Miller's information processing theory, it says that working memory can hold 5 to 9 chunks of information. So that's where we get our 5 to 9, 10 chunks of lexis. From there, we've got that introduction of those chunks of language, and that's either going to move into long-term memory or it will disappear and be lost. So it's important to remember that you're getting that correct amount of cognitive load. You're not overburdening students and you're enabling them to process the language better and to achieve learning and understanding and comprehension. Another one I'd also mention is Krashen, who needs no introduction, I'm sure. But his input hypothesis, or the monitor model, that breaks down into 5 further hypotheses, but 2 which I'll pick out, which I think are super relevant for lower levels. Comprehensible input, so that's with their formula I plus 1. I meaning the student's current level, for example, A1, and plus 1 meaning a little bit more, so A1 plus. And this predicts that your inputs should allow the students to comprehend what you're saying and be a little bit more so that you're stretching them. They've got the comprehension and the learning together. And that's really key, I think, for lower levels. Again, it's not overburdening them, it's getting it at the right pitch, the input, the target language that you're teaching in that lesson or the skill that you're teaching. And his last hypothesis, which I think is really great, is the affective filter hypothesis. And that's the one dealing with emotional variables, which I think we really, really see at lower levels. All that fear, all that anxiety of learning a new language. So, and that's just being aware of, in my classroom for lower levels, is it positive? Is it friendly? Is it supportive? Is it empowering? Are you telling people off if they make mistakes? That's not so great. We want to think about having that affective filter lowered so that students feel comfortable and can learn. If the affective filter is up, then that means that they've blocked themselves from all those bad experiences of the classroom, and then the learning can't get in. So that's something to remember. And there is also a study that came out a couple of years ago from 2019 related to the affective filter hypothesis. That looked at A1, B1 and B2 students, and it asked them to complete a self-questionnaire about the success and failure of their learning, the causal attributions. Why did they succeed, in their opinion? Why did they fail, in their opinion? And the really interesting thing to me in this finding is that the higher level students blamed external factors. So it was the teacher or it was the task that they had to do. It wasn't them. Whereas the A1 students, they completely blamed themselves. It was their fault because they hadn't understood, they hadn't worked hard enough. It was all internal. So that's something to really be aware of, that you're making sure students feel empowered and able and confident in their language learning.
So linked to everything you've just been saying, as avid followers of the podcast will know, I've been trying to learn Japanese during the pandemic. So I was wondering, do you think there's anything you can learn from your experience of learning a language? Is there anything you can take from that to apply to teaching in the classroom, especially with beginners?
I think so, yes. You can definitely remember that overall feeling, the emotional side and the sort of fear of being there as a beginner and trying to comprehend what's going on. You can definitely think about the amount of input. So as a language learner yourself, how did you feel with the quantity of language that you were receiving? Was it manageable? Was it too much? And also the context. Are there extra little words that you've managed to pick up? And that's interesting. I remember starting to learn Italian and hearing allora all the time. And just those little thinking words, things that are really natural and lovely. So you might be able to think, well, maybe I allow myself to say those things as a teacher, because it's a nice little bit of extra indirect learning going on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Rhona, especially that empathy, I think, with the students, and having been in that situation yourself, you can empathise with them a lot more as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a brave thing to do, isn't it? To turn up even to another country and go on a language course.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the point you made as well about cognitive load theory is really interesting, because as teachers sometimes, maybe it was just me, but we have a tendency to be over ambitious in what we want to cover in a class.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I think, and that's an important point actually with beginners, isn't it? That it might take you what appears to be an incredibly long time to progress through your course book, but maybe that's because your students are actually learning, and and their competence is greater and greater than if you got through that course book in 2-3 weeks, because it would be very easy to speed through a page of a course book in a lesson. But actually what you want is good learning and moving that language into the long-term memory and building always and just increasing that overall competence.
Yeah, and certainly that's true from my own experience, that, I take a very, very long time to go through the books that I'm using at home, but because I want to be really sure that I understand it and I've got it before I move on.
But yeah, exactly.
So could you tell us what some of your favourite classroom activities are for beginners?
Yeah, quite a lot of games, and that's partly for fun and to keep the classroom positive, and also because it's a great way to activate the language in a really non-threatening, safe way. So Pictionary is fantastic for drawing food items, for example, or other vocabulary items. Songs are always great. So if you can find, obviously checking the lyrics are good and safe and appropriate before. So simple songs, Gene Kelly, I'm Singing in the Rain, Louis Armstrong, What a Wonderful World, Police, Every Breath You Take, things that have got nice, simple vowel sounds. They're great. And also, I think that's really nice to, even at this level, make sure you're using authentic materials, because that's such a huge sense of achievement then for the students, that they've managed to interact and comprehend something real, not just something from your course book. All you have to do is just choose that authentic material and grade your task around it. So you could watch a bit of a clip from a TV show or a movie, and you're just identifying a man, a woman, a colour. It could be that simple. So Pictionary, songs are good. Any sort of spelling games where maybe students are in a group of 5 or 6, and you give them a word to spell. Each student spells one letter of that word in turn. Anything TPR is great to do. Class mingles, I love doing anything to get them up, moving around and talking to as many of the other students as possible. And that can be as simple as, what's your name? I'm Rhona. It can be like that. In one of your first lessons, you can do WhatsApp messages, set up a group so they're sending, again, something as simple as that, just saying their name or where they live. And also audio scripts are really great to exploit, I think. So say if you've listened to a conversation in class, you can then do that again, play it again, so students just listen and follow it in their heads, or they can act it as a role play, or you can play part of the audio script, hit pause, and students say the next line without looking at their notes. And that's really great because it sounds sort of fun and silly and simple, but you're getting students used to that notion of turn taking, the pragmatics of speaking. And pronunciation work is great as well. I always try to keep committed to that even from the beginning with lower levels. So work on the sounds, work on syllable stress, lots of choral drills with the whole class, individual drills, work on the it and the e the difference between long and short sounds.
And I love what you said there about authentic material for low levels, just because it's so important, I think, for your confidence as much as anything, and getting the understanding to everyone actually using the material, that you don't need to fully understand what's actually being said, do you? You know, like the tendency is to find a video and try to make it so they understand every single word in that video. But actually, you can exploit it in lots of different ways, can't you? It's about what they see, or just the general gist of what's happening. And that's so much about confidence as a learner, because you understand that actually this is not intimidating. I can still get something from this.
Exactly. It's such a motivating, powerful thing to do. And it's a bit of relief, isn't it, from the course book or the sort of normal state materials. It's a great thing to include.
Rhona, is there, just thinking about, obviously beginners develop and improve, and you've been talking about techniques and approaches of teaching beginners, but is there one day when they're no longer a beginner and therefore this emphasis on these techniques changes and as they become elementary, or is it obviously a matter of degrees? I mean, what happens when they are no longer beginners?
Oh, that's a great question. I think all of these things are just fundamentals of good basic teaching. You know, I just think with lower levels, the main difference is you need to be on your A game as a teacher. You can't wing it. You need to be on your A game for sure. And I think, yes, definitely, if they, when they reach elementary, when they're knocking on the door of B1 and getting there, there's going to be a lot less repetition. Maybe you won't need to spend so long on drilling in what those words are, or explaining a grammar point, or having quite as much practice. You still want to be providing a decent amount of practice, though, and making sure that students really have consolidated that knowledge before you move on. But I think it's going to be a quicker pace and a little bit less.
Okay, thank you. So now let's move on to the Q&A part of the podcast.
Well, first up this month, we have Marta from Poland, who asks, what do you think the optimal percentage of L1 is to use with beginners?
0. That's your optimal target. But no, that's a really interesting question, Marta. And I don't know if I can't say that from a particular study it's X percentage. My feeling from experience and from writing is that you want the vast majority to be in English. So I'd say no more than 20%. So the vast majority is in English. But having said that, if you've got a huge class, or you're just maybe new to lower levels, so you feel that yourself, you wouldn't mind using a bit of the language as well, if it helps you a tiny bit, then why not start at maybe 50% at the beginning, but be really upfront with your students and say, okay, there'll be some first language now, but as the weeks progress, as the classes progress, I'm going to be speaking more English and less whatever the first language is. So that's probably a way to tackle it. If you need to start a bit higher, fine, but reduce and aim for, if you can get to 0, amazing, but 15, 20%, something like that.
Okay, our next question comes from Sherry in the US, who asks, what are some ways to manage adult classes that include a mixture of true beginners and false beginners?
So yeah, mixed abilities are always a challenge, but I think, as we said a bit earlier, within A1, A2, these lower levels, I don't think it's as huge a gap. So first and foremost, I'd say don't worry too much about that. I definitely think about, as always, your classroom management and getting those students mixing and talking to each and everyone. So you're splitting up those 2 levels, those false and true beginners. You've got pair work, group work, breakout rooms that are including both sets of students. And don't worry that the false beginner is with a true beginner, because even at this level, you still need that recycling, you still need that reviewing. And also, if we think about real life, non-native speakers interacting with other non-native speakers, 75% of English interaction is non-native speaker to non-native speaker. So your students, it's pretty unlikely that they're going to be talking always to someone of exactly the same level. It's just practice for real life. So don't worry about that too much. And also that swapping, that mingling of groups, the peer learning is a brilliant thing to foster in your classroom. Really, really good. Do go for that. If you really want to acknowledge the 2 levels, then you could go the route of having standby materials. And that could be as simple as an extra worksheet for those students who finish quicker. Something, I don't know, practicing a little bit of present simple, a grammar exercise, something that simple for them. Or you could just change the task a little bit, So if a student is struggling, maybe you put them in pairs with another student who's a true beginner so they can help each other and work together. But the false beginner asks them to do the task by themselves. Something like that.
And finally, Ziji from China asks, have you got any suggestions for a class of 40 to 50 young learners who are all absolute beginners, or near enough?
Firstly, Gigi, that you're an absolute superhero. That's an amazing teaching situation to be confronted with, because you've got low level, large class. It's large by anyone's definition, and it's young learners. So that's amazing. I'm making the assumptions that that's going to be monolingual, or the same language, and it's face-to-face in a school. So my first suggestion would be use your L1. This is, if that's available to you, use the L1. This is definitely a situation where that would be useful in terms of just setting up and organising and welcoming the class at the beginning, just practicals and pragmatics, or for those particular occasions if there's a behaviour issue, a safety issues, something like that. So definitely, if you want to, if that makes things easier, start with that first language. And then think about your input. And I'd suggest that whatever your aim is, your target language for the lesson, reduce that again from your aim and keep it really, really small and simple. So say it might just be presenting numbers 1 to 5. That's it. And then for the rest of the lesson, make sure you've got a whole army of practice activities to go through that. So that's drilling the numbers. It's counting out beads or paper clips of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's colouring in the digits 1 to 5. It's putting posters on the walls 1 to 5 and getting students to run to them. Or it's getting students to form a group and lie on the ground in the shape of the digit 1, the digit 2, the digit 3, etc. And you can do that. You might want to do that as a whole class, which will be simply you'll have to embrace the chaos and the noise and go with it. It's going to be high energy. Or you could do something I used to do with a Bambini class I had, was like a circuits class, have a number of different workstations and have a timer. So 6-7 minutes on one activity. So here there's a word search in that corner. Over there you're colouring something in. Over here you're reading a short sentence, or you're tracing letters. Something like that where you're keeping them super busy. So it will be a fair amount of preparation and creation of materials probably. But you're going to get, an awful lot of activities from the class, and you'll be able to reuse that a fair amount within one lesson or the next lesson. So it will balance itself out in terms of the time you're giving to preparing.
Well, that's about it for the show. A huge thank you to our guest this month, Rhona Snelling.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Rhona, where can people find you online?
I'm on LinkedIn, just search me there, or my website, rhonasnelling.com.
I'd also like to thank my panellists, Zoe and Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And as always, thank you for listening. For questions, suggestions, or any other feedback, please email us at pearsonenglish@pearson.com or visit our Facebook page, Pearson English. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe to us on SoundCloud, Spotify, or iTunes. And until next month, this is the Pearson English Podcast.